The whispering sands of Lop Nor. Why Silk Road merchants feared the desert that spoke. Imagine walking through a desert so silent you can hear your own heartbeat until the dunes begin to moan your name.
Chapter 1. The Desert That Hunts You Back. Imagine walking through a desert so silent you can hear your own heartbeat until the dunes begin to moan your name. Not a wind, not an echo, something beneath the sand, rhythmic, deliberate, and close. Something that sounds in the bone-dry silence of the world's most remote basin, almost exactly like a human voice. For 1,000 years, Silk Road merchants crossed a place called Lop Nor on the edge of the Taklamakan Desert in western China. They carried silk, jade, and gold. They carried maps. They carried enough water for the crossing. And they still disappeared. By the dozens, by the hundreds, entire caravans swallowed whole by a wasteland that shouldn't have been that dangerous.
The survivors, the ones who staggered out, all described the same thing. A sound rising from the earth itself, a moaning that grew louder at night, voices that whispered in languages they didn't recognize, and a compulsion, overpowering and irrational, to walk toward the sound rather than away from it.
History labeled them hallucinating, dehydrated, delirious. The stories were filed under myth and left there for centuries. But here's what history didn't tell you. The sound is real. Scientists have measured it, and the explanation, when it finally came, was somehow more terrifying than the myth. Stay with me, because this story goes somewhere you are not expecting. Chapter 2. The Place at the End of the World. To understand what happened to those merchants, you need to understand where Lop Nor actually is, because it is, by almost every geographical measure, one of the most hostile places on the surface of the Earth. Lop Nor sits in the eastern Tarim Basin of what is now China's Xinjiang province. It is bordered on 3 sides by mountain ranges so high that weather systems can barely cross them. The Kunlun Mountains to the south, the Tian Shan Range to the north, the Pamirs to the west. The result is a natural pressure cooker, a closed depression with almost zero humidity, temperatures that swing from scorching summer heat above 50 degrees Celsius to bone-shattering winter cold below minus 30 degrees Celsius, and winds that can strip skin from bone.
The Taklamakan Desert, whose name in the local Uyghur language is commonly translated as "you go in, you don't come out," covers an area roughly the size of Germany. Lop Nor sits on its eastern edge, at its lowest, most sunken point. Water that drains from the surrounding mountains flows down and ends here. It has nowhere else to go.
For most of recorded history, Lop Nor was a shallow lake, the final resting place of rivers flowing down from the Tibetan Plateau. Ancient Chinese maps show it as a substantial body of water, shimmering in the middle of the desert, a genuine oasis that made the Silk Road crossing survivable. Cities grew on its shores. Marco Polo passed through and noted the lake in the 13th century. It teemed with fish. Reeds grew tall along its banks. But Lop Nor was never stable. Fed by shifting rivers, it moved. Sometimes it filled. Sometimes it emptied. Ancient geographers puzzled over why it seemed to migrate across the landscape over decades, appearing on one map in one location and another map in an entirely different spot. They called it the Wandering Lake. They didn't yet understand that a lake with no outlet, one that only loses water through evaporation, leaves behind something. It leaves salt.
And salt, as the Silk Road merchants discovered, has a very specific relationship with sound. A relationship that would not be scientifically explained for another 1,000 years. And when it was, the explanation raised a question that nobody had thought to ask. Why does the desert only sing when people
are near. Chapter 3. The Trail of Bones. The Silk Road was not a road. It was a network of routes, thousands of kilometers of shifting trails across mountain and desert, connecting China to the Mediterranean world. Merchants carrying silk, spices, glassware, and gold traveled these routes for over 1,000 years, from roughly 130 BCE until the rise of sea trade in the 15th century. The Lop Nor crossing was unavoidable for traders moving between China and Central Asia. It was also, by the common consensus of every traveler who survived it, the most dangerous single stretch of the entire Silk Road. More feared than mountain passes, more feared than bandits, more feared than the scorching deserts of Arabia. Marco Polo travels circa 1300 CE. If, while asleep, any merchant lagged behind or went aside from the road, on awaking he would see visions and hear spirit voices, and often these voices would call him by name. Thus many men have gone astray and been lost. Marco Polo was not a man given to superstition. He was a sharp-eyed Venetian merchant with a talent for precise observation and a deep suspicion of stories he couldn't verify. And yet he recorded the voices of Lop Nor with the same matter-of-fact certainty he used to describe the price of pepper in Kublai Khan's markets. The voices were real. He had heard them himself, or something he couldn't explain as anything else. He was not alone. Chinese Buddhist monks crossing to India in the 5th and 7th centuries wrote about the desert spirits in their travel diaries. Arab traders in the 9th century described similar phenomena to geographers who compiled their reports in Baghdad. A 10th century Persian traveler named al-Biruni specifically noted that the sounds were loudest when the wind blew from the east, a detail that, 1,000 years later, would turn out to be scientifically significant. But here's the detail that the history books skim past. The disappearances weren't random. Archaeologists and historians who have studied the Silk Road casualty records, cross-referencing trade accounts, court documents, and expedition logs, found a disturbing pattern. The travelers who vanished at Lop Nor were disproportionately the experienced ones, the veterans, the merchants who had made the crossing before. Not the frightened first-timers, but the confident, seasoned travelers who thought they knew what the desert could do to them. Why would experienced travelers be more likely to disappear? That question sat unanswered for centuries. The answer, when it came, required understanding what the sound actually was and what it does to the human brain. Chapter 4. What the sand is actually doing. The phenomenon has a scientific name, booming dunes, or more formally, acoustic emission from granular flow. It occurs in roughly 35 deserts worldwide, the Sahara, the Namib, the Arabian Desert, the Gobi. But Lop Nor produces some of the most intense examples ever measured, for reasons that have everything to do with salt. Here is what physically happens. When dry, rounded sand grains of a very specific size, coated in a very specific way, slide down a dune face or are disturbed by a footstep or a wind, they vibrate. Not randomly, they synchronize. Thousands, then millions of grains begin vibrating at the same frequency, creating a resonance that builds and amplifies through the layers of sand beneath them. The sound emerges from the earth itself, a deep, sustained moan ranging from 50 to 300 hertz, audible from miles away. Recorded frequencies from booming dunes at Lop Nor have been measured between 80 and 130 hertz, the same frequency range as a low male voice. The human auditory system is exquisitely tuned to detect and interpret sounds in this range. It is, not coincidentally, the frequency at which a human being moans in distress. But the standard explanation, that it's just vibrating sand, still doesn't fully account for what travelers described. The voices, the sense of being called by name. the directional quality of the sound that made it seem to come from a specific location rather than from everywhere at once. The key factor that makes Lop Nor uniquely terrifying is the salt crust. When the wandering lake was present, it deposited salt across thousands of square kilometers of flat terrain as it evaporated. That flat, hard, reflective salt surface acts as a perfect acoustic mirror, bouncing and channeling the sound from booming dunes across the desert floor with almost no attenuation. Sound that would fade within meters in a normal landscape travels at Lop Nor for kilometers. And when it bounces off multiple salt surfaces and reaches you from several different directions at slightly different times, the human brain, desperately trying to locate the source, does something it shouldn't. It starts to interpret the overlapping signals as structured sound, as language, as voices.
You are not hallucinating. Your ears are working perfectly. Your brain is working perfectly. It is doing exactly what brains evolved to do: pattern matching, source locating, parsing meaning from sound. The desert isn't driving you mad. It is exploiting the most fundamental feature of your cognition, and it has been doing so for 1,000,000 years longer than human beings have been crossing it. Now go back to that disturbing pattern: the experienced travelers disappearing more often than the novices. A first-time traveler crossing Lop Nor hears the sound and is terrified. They grip their guide. They stay close to the caravan. They don't wander. Their fear is their protection. An experienced traveler has crossed before. They know the desert moans. They've heard it. They've been told it's just the sand. They're not afraid of it anymore.
And when the sound resolves in their exhausted, dehydrated, heat-stressed brain into something that sounds like a voice calling from just over there, 50 meters ahead, just beyond that rise, they go and look. Because they're not afraid. Because they know the desert. Because they think they know the desert.
Chapter 5: The Lake That Swallowed Cities. By the 20th century, the wandering lake had wandered for the last time. The rivers that fed it, the Tarim and the Conky, had been diverted for irrigation further upstream. By 1972, when the first satellite images were taken of Lop Nor, the lake was completely gone. In its place, 3,000 square kilometers of white salt crust, baked hard as concrete. When seen from space, it looks with eerie precision, like a giant human ear pressed to the surface of the Earth. Chinese scientists who noticed the resemblance named it with dry scientific humor, the ear of Lop Nor. They probably did not intend the metaphor to be as apt as it turned out to be. In 1980, Chinese explorer Peng Jiamu disappeared while leading a scientific expedition through Lop Nor. No trace of him was ever found, despite massive search operations. In 1996, explorer Yu Chun-shun died of dehydration in the same basin after his supplies ran out. Both were experienced, well-prepared, and knew the terrain. Both vanished. But what scientists discovered when they began seriously studying the dry lakebed was something that reframed the entire history of the Whispering Sands. The salt crust at Lop Nor is not uniform. It is layered, years of accumulation, each layer recording the chemistry of the water that deposited it. Drilling through the crust is like reading a geological diary going back tens of thousands of years. And what that diary revealed was this: Lop Nor has not always been a salt flat. It has been, at various points in the past 10,000 years, a freshwater lake, a brackish sea, a deep blue oasis, and a dead white wasteland, cycling between these states as climate shifted and rivers changed course. The cities that grew on its shores during the wet periods didn't simply move when the water left. Some of them didn't have time to move.
Archaeological excavations in the early 20th century, led by the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin, uncovered the ruins of Loulan, a city of 14,000 people that sat on the northern shore of Lop Nor during the height of the Silk Road era. Loulan was one of the most strategic cities in Central Asia, a required stop, a customs checkpoint, a place where merchants rested and caravans reformed. By the 4th century CE, it was gone. Not conquered, not burned, simply abandoned in apparent haste, with documents still in the houses, food still in the storage jars, and no record of where the inhabitants went. The lake had moved. The water was gone. The city was left in the path of the booming dunes. The whispering sands had swallowed not just individual travelers, they had swallowed an entire civilization. And because no one understood what had happened, the ruins of Loulan sat buried under the salt and sand for 1,500 years, while the desert above it moaned on. Chapter 6. What they buried beneath the sand. Now we arrive at the part of this story that the tourist brochures and the geology textbooks leave out. Because Lop Nor's modern history is not the story of a singing desert or a wandering lake. It is the story of something the Chinese government did with the most remote, most inhospitable, most perfectly empty basin in Central Asia, and did for decades, while the Silk Road merchants' bones still lay somewhere beneath the salt. Between 1964 and 1996, the People's Republic of China conducted 45 nuclear weapons tests at Lop Nor. 45, above ground and below ground. The largest of them, detonated in 1967, was a thermonuclear device with a yield of 3.3 megatons, roughly 220 times the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The salt flat that had once been a lake, that had grown and shrunk and wandered for 10,000 years, that had sustained the Silk Road and swallowed Loulan, became in the second half of the 20th century the primary nuclear testing ground of the world's most populous nation. The Lop Nor nuclear tests exposed an estimated 1.48 million people in the surrounding Xinjiang region to radioactive fallout, according to research by Japanese scientist Jun Takada. The Chinese government did not acknowledge civilian casualties from the tests until decades later. Some researchers believe the total exposure was among the highest inflicted on any civilian population during the Cold War nuclear testing era. The desert that whispered to the ancient merchants now shook with the loudest sounds ever produced by human beings. The sand that had moaned in frequencies matching the human voice now vibrated with shock waves that could be felt in cities hundreds of kilometers away. And here is the connection that makes your skin crawl. The nuclear tests, it turned out, altered the acoustic properties of the salt crust. The shock waves compacted and fractured the surface in specific patterns that changed how the sand vibrated. Some researchers believe the Lop Nor booming dunes became louder and more complex in the years after the nuclear program ended, the disturbed salt layers creating new resonance chambers that hadn't existed before. The desert had been given a new voice by the weapons that were tested there, a voice shaped in part by the energy of nuclear fire. The ancient merchants feared a desert that whispered. What they could not have imagined was what the modern world would whisper into it. Chapter 7. The desert always knew we were there. So let's bring it all together, because there's one final piece of this story, and it's the piece that changes everything that came before it. I told you that booming dunes sing when their sand is disturbed, by wind, by footsteps, by the slow avalanche of grains down a dune face. This is true. But the research into Lop Nor specifically revealed something that the general booming dune literature obscures. At Lop Nor, the most intense acoustic events don't happen randomly. They happen in response to pressure, specifically in response to weight on the salt crust. When something heavy crosses the Lop Nor flat, a caravan of horses and merchants, a line of vehicles, a group of scientists with equipment, the weight depresses the salt crust fractionally. That depression sends pressure waves through the layers of salt beneath. Those waves disturb the sand on nearby dune faces.
and the dunes begin to sing.
The desert doesn't just happen to make sound near people. The desert makes sound because of people. The ancient merchants walking across Lop Nor were triggering the very phenomenon that terrified them. Their footsteps were the cause. The desert was answering them. Every step they took toward the sound caused more sound. Every caravan that crossed the basin was unknowingly playing an instrument made of salt and sand. And the instrument played back, in frequencies tuned by geological accident to the precise range of the human voice. The desert was always, in the most literal physical sense, responding to human presence. It heard them first. It always heard them first. This is what the Silk Road merchants could not have known, and what we now know. Lop Nor is not haunted. It is not malevolent. It contains no spirits. The voices calling from just over the next dune are not real. They are the architecture of sound bouncing off a salt mirror built over 10,000 years by a wandering lake. But
understanding it does not make it less terrifying. If anything, it makes it more so. Because haunted places can be exorcised. Malevolent forces can be defeated. What you cannot defeat is physics. What you cannot silence is geology. What you cannot argue with is a landscape that was doing this for 10,000 years before any human being set foot on it, and will be doing it for 10,000 years after the last human being leaves. The Silk Road merchants who disappeared at Lop Nor walked toward a sound that their own footsteps had created. They followed a voice that was, in the truest sense, an echo of themselves. And the desert kept calling, long after they had gone, for anyone else who might be passing through.
Lop Nor is still there. The salt flat is still there. The booming dunes are still there. Some of them rearranged, some of them new. All of them still resonating in the precise frequency range of the human voice. If you crossed it today, in the silence between your footsteps, you would hear it. A low moan rising from the ground. Not a wind, not an echo. Something beneath the sand. Rhythmic, deliberate, and close. Something that sounds almost exactly like a human voice. And it would be real, and it would be geological, and it would be answering you. The desert has always known we were there. It just never told us what it heard.